He had always believed that his love was strong, that his marriage was sincere, but in the final moments of his life, his wife confessed the secret she had kept for her entire existence. The weight of those words still burned in his mind. They were not mere whispers from a woman on the brink of death. They were the fracture of a reality he had believed to be unbreakable. Are you still not subscribed? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the bell so you get notified every time there's a new video. The year was 1955. In a world divided by skin color, the United States still clung to the chains of racial segregation. Jim Crow laws dictated not only where a black man could walk, eat, or sit, but also whom he could look at. A simple glance could mean ruin, a misinterpreted smile, death. In the South, violence was explicit, a constant threat lurking around every corner. But the North, though less brutal, was no safe haven. There were no written laws forbidding a black man and a white woman from loving each other. But society's judgment was a silent enemy, always watching, always ready to punish. Oliver Bryant had learned these lessons from childhood. He was born in a small southern town where poverty and injustice were not anomalies, but daily realities. He grew up watching his father bent over from working in a factory, his knuckles hardened, his back marked by exhaustion. His mother, a woman whose voice was swallowed by the walls of white homes she cleaned, returned home each day with worn hands, but her dignity intact. From a young age, Oliver understood that in his world, options were scarce. If he wanted to survive, he had to learn to move carefully, speak cautiously, and above all, avoid drawing unwanted attention. Over time, he found his place in a mechanic's workshop, a space where his hands could work without prejudice interfering. There, among the noise of tools and the scent of burnt oil, he built a small stability. It wasn't much, but it was his. He was a tall man, dark-skinned with sharp features, carrying a quiet confidence that, without meaning to, stirred unease in some and fascination in others. He knew his presence was dangerous in certain places, in certain situations, and so he was always careful until he met her. Sarah Whitmore was the absolute contrast to his world. Born into a wealthy white family, she had never known hunger, fear, or deprivation. Her childhood was filled with silk dresses, society balls, and strict etiquette rules. Her destiny had been written the day she was born. She was to be an exemplary wife, submissive, an elegant shadow of a powerful man. But Sarah had never felt like she belonged in that world. Her restless mind pushed her to challenge the rules, to seek something beyond the confines of her golden cage. The first time she saw Oliver was at one of those clandestine gatherings where jazz became a whisper of rebellion. In those dimly lit, smoke-filled basements, racial barriers blurred for a few hours. They were spaces where young people, both black and white, shared glances, drinks, and secrets they would never dare admit in the daylight. Sarah saw him from across the room, leaning against the wall with a serious expression, watching the world with the caution of a man who knew the dangers of existing. She wasn't supposed to look at him. She wasn't supposed to approach him, but she did. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the music. Oliver hesitated. He could feel the eyes on them, the tension hanging in the air. "Oliver," he finally answered, his voice deep, measured. She smiled, and in that moment, without him knowing it, his fate was sealed. What followed was inevitable. Quiet conversations in hidden corners, secret meetings in the shadows of the night, laughter muffled by the fear of being discovered. It was a dangerous game, one where victory only meant survival, but the world was not kind to loves like theirs. The night Sarah's father discovered them, Oliver knew his life would never be the same. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you'll stay updated on our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing. Charles Whitmore was an imposing man, one of those who didn't need to raise his voice to assert his authority. When he stepped out of his car that night, his face hardened into an expression of restrained fury. His eyes bore into Oliver like sharp knives. Sarah tried to speak, but her father silenced her with a cold glare. Without saying a word, he grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the mechanic's shop. Oliver didn't move. He knew that if he did, if he even took one step toward them, this wouldn't end with just shouting. The next morning, he found a note slipped under the shop's door. "Stay away from my daughter." It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. From that moment on, everything changed. Sarah was locked in her home, her movements restricted, her life controlled with the precision of a jailer watching his prisoner. But Sarah's will was stronger than the chains of her family name. She found a way to reach Oliver, to send him messages, to defy the power that held her captive. And one night, with only a small bag in her hands and a burning fear in her chest, she ran. She ran with him. She ran from her name, her lineage, the life her father had built for her. They thought the hardest part was behind them. That love would be enough to sustain them. They didn't know the worst was yet to come. The early morning air was dense, heavy, thick with the uncertainty of those leaving everything behind. Sarah and Oliver ran through the empty streets, their shadows stretching beneath the dim glow of streetlights. They didn't speak, didn't dare. Only the sound of their hurried footsteps and the deafening beat of their hearts filled the silence of the night. They arrived at the train station breathless, their bodies tense, electrified by the fear of being caught. On the platform, only a few workers were loading crates into a freight car. Sarah, her hands trembling, clutched Oliver's as if her life depended on it. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded without hesitation. The train that would take them north wasn't a passenger train. They couldn't afford the luxury of tickets, nor could they risk being seen at a busy station. Oliver knew someone, a railway worker who owed him a favor, someone who would look the other way when they slipped between the freight cars. The wooden floor was cold and hard as they finally settled among the grain sacks. Oliver covered her with his jacket and pulled her close to his chest. She trembled, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from fear. The first few days were a test of endurance. They barely slept, their bodies tense and alert at every stop, every noise, every shadow shifting in the distance. Only when the landscape began to change, when the cotton fields faded behind them and buildings rose on the horizon, did they allow themselves something resembling hope. Chicago. It wasn't a paradise, but it was better. There, in neighborhoods where faces were as diverse as the languages spoken in the streets, they found a chance to start over. No one looked at them twice. No one whispered with disdain as they passed. The city wasn't kind, but at least it didn't care about them. Oliver found work in a steel mill, a hell of fire and sweat, where men emerged each night covered in soot and exhaustion. He didn't complain. It was honest. It was work, and more. Than anything, it was enough to rent a small room in a cheap boarding house. Sarah, on the other hand, learned to survive in a world she had never known. Her hands, once accustomed to the softness of lace and porcelain, soon roughened from the coarse fabric she handled as a seamstress. The first time she had to mend her own clothes, she felt a part of her old life crumble. But she never looked back. Months turned into years. Life was not easy, but little by little they built something that resembled a routine, a home. One day, without grand announcements or celebrations, they married in a small brick church. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses offering condescending smiles. It was just the two of them, and a pastor who barely looked up from the book in his hands. "For better or for worse," Sarah whispered, clutching Oliver's hands. She had no idea how true those words would become. Their first child arrived soon after, Isaac, a boy with copper-toned skin and wide eyes that looked at the world with the same cautious gaze as his father. When Sarah held him in her arms for the first time, she felt more than love. She felt fear, because Isaac was a reminder of everything she had left behind. Guilt struck her with a force she hadn't expected. Sarah had had another child, one she had never held, never sung to sleep. A child born in a closed-off room with thick curtains, taken from her side before his first cry had even faded. Her father had handled everything with surgical precision. No questions were asked, no choices were given. "This is for the best," her mother had told her in a lifeless voice. "This is necessary." And she had let him go. Now, with Isaac nestled against her chest, his tiny fist clutching her dress, she felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. She never told Oliver. The past had to stay buried, but the past doesn't disappear. As the years passed, life in the city taught them that racism did not vanish simply by crossing a state border. The stares remained. The whispers on the streets persisted. The tension in certain places still lingered. Oliver endured it all in silence. It wasn't new to him. He knew he could never fully escape what defined him in the eyes of others. But what enraged him was seeing how it affected Sarah. He saw her shrink when a white woman looked at her with disgust in the market. He saw her lower her head when a group of men watched her with contempt in the street. He saw her tremble when Isaac started asking questions she didn't know how to answer. "Mama, why do some kids say I'm not like them?" Sarah didn't know what to say. And then Margaret came. Their daughter was a whirlwind, a storm in a small body. Nothing scared her. Nothing silenced her. She loved running through the streets without fear, talking to anyone without hesitation. "Margaret doesn't understand," Sarah whispered one night, looking at her husband. "She's still young," Oliver said with a shrug. "But one day she'll grow up and the world will hurt her." Oliver didn't respond. He knew it too. But there were things even a father couldn't prevent. The years marched on, relentless. The family grew, and with it, so did the silences. Sarah became quieter, more distant. Oliver noticed the shadows in her eyes, the weight on her shoulders, but he never asked until one day a letter arrived at their home, a white envelope, no return address, with only one line written inside. "I know who you are." Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That night, Oliver found her sitting in the dark, the letter crumpled in her hands. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady. Sarah didn't answer, because in that moment she knew the past she had tried to forget, had finally caught up with her, and the worst was yet to come. Nights were no longer peaceful for Sarah. From the moment that letter reached her hands, insomnia became her shadow. She lay beside Oliver, his breathing steady next to her, but her eyes remained open in the dim light. She thought about the child she had left behind. She thought about the stranger who now knew who she was. Who had written the letter? What did they want from her? Why now? She couldn't keep hiding it. But how could she explain to Oliver that she had another child, that she had let him go without a fight, without resistance? That she had allowed it to happen because back then she had been too weak, too afraid to do anything else. Oliver started noticing the changes. "Sarah, something is wrong. Tell me." But she couldn't. Not yet. The past was a beast that had awakened, and she could feel its breath on the back of her neck, the man on the corner. At first, it was just a suspicion, a strange feeling whenever she left the house, as if someone was watching her. Then it became a certainty. There was a man in a suit, wearing a dark hat that shadowed part of his face. He never did anything. He never approached. He never spoke. But he was there, always. Sometimes standing at the corner of the street, other times a few yards away from the market where she bought bread and milk for the children. Sarah tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't. Fear began to consume her from the inside. Was it her father, someone he had sent to find her, or was it someone else? But one thing was certain. Whoever it was knew what she had done. One afternoon, as she was locking the door to the house, she found a second envelope. Inside, a single sentence. "Your son is looking for you." Sarah felt her stomach drop. He knew. Tuki, child she had left behind. He had grown up, and now he was searching for her. She couldn't hold back the tears. Her body trembled as she read those words over and over again. From the living room, Isaac watched her, holding his book, his legs crossed on the floor. "Mama?" Sarah took a deep breath and hid the envelope behind her back. "Nothing, sweetheart. Everything's fine," but it wasn't. She couldn't keep living this lie. Not with Oliver. Not with their children. The confession that night, she waited until Isaac and Margaret were asleep. Then she went to the kitchen where Oliver was going over the household accounts at the table. "I need to talk to you." He looked up. "Go ahead, Sarah." Remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight in her chest. Then, without hesitation, she placed the letter on the table. Oliver frowned as he read it. "What is this?" Sarah swallowed hard. "It's about my past, about something I never told." "You?" Oliver watched her carefully. "What is it, Sarah?" His voice was calm, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Sarah closed her eyes for a second. Then she said it. "Before I met you, I had a child." Oliver stopped breathing. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt tears slip down her face. "I was very young. My father arranged everything. They kept me hidden for months, and when I gave birth, they didn't even let me hold him. They gave him to another family before I could say anything." Oliver slowly put the letter aside. "And you never thought to tell me?" "I was afraid," she whispered, "afraid that you'd judge me, afraid you'd think I was still that same cowardly girl who didn't fight for him." Oliver pushed back his chair and stood up. He walked toward the window, his jaw clenched. "And now I find out I have a son through an anonymous letter." Sarah felt her world crumbling. "I didn't want you to find out this way." Oliver turned around. His expression was a storm of emotions: anger, disappointment, disbelief. "Do you know what the worst part is? That you never gave me the chance to be part of this truth, to search for him together." Sarah lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Oliver ran a hand over his face. "And now what? Are you going to look for him?" Sarah stayed silent. "I don't know," but she did. She knew she couldn't ignore it. Her son was looking for her, and sooner or later she would have to face him. Tension hung over the house for days. Oliver spoke little. Isaac and Margaret noticed the change, but neither of them understood what was happening. Until one afternoon, someone knocked at the door. Sarah knew before she even opened it. When she turned the knob and the door creaked open, there he was. Young man with dark, curly hair and eyes that reminded her of her own, her son. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Are you Sarah Whitmore?" His voice was low, controlled, but charged with something deep. Sarah swallowed hard. "I was." The young man nodded. "Then you're my mother." The words crashed over her like an avalanche. Sarah brought a hand to her mouth. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never once had it felt real. Yet here he was, standing right in front of her. Oliver appeared behind Sarah, silent, his gaze locked onto the young man. The boy shifted his attention from his mother to Oliver. "And you?" Oliver held his gaze. "I'm her husband." The young man nodded slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to know the truth." Sarah felt her body tremble. "Come in," she whispered. The young man stepped inside, his stride steady, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Oliver shut the door behind them, and just like that, after more than 2 decades, the past Sarah had tried to leave behind entered her home. The weight of decisions, secrets, and lost time was about to explode, and no one would walk away unscathed. The silence in the room was suffocating. Sarah felt the air grow heavier with each passing second. Across from her, her son, the son she had abandoned, sat on one of the wooden chairs beside the table. His expression was a mixture of hardness and vulnerability, the look of a man who had learned not to expect anything from anyone. Do you want more stories like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell because there's always new content here, and you won't want to miss it. Oliver stood, watching him with an unreadable expression. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was tension, an ocean of unspoken questions brewing beneath his silence. Sarah didn't know where to begin. "Your name," she finally whispered. "What's your name?" The young man narrowed his eyes slightly. "My name is James. James Carter." Sarah repeated the name in her mind, feeling it both strange and familiar at the same time. James. Not the name she would have given him, not the name she had imagined in her guilt-ridden dreams. "Who raised you?" she asked, her voice unsteady. James leaned his elbows on the table, intertwining his fingers. "A white family, a married couple with no children. They weren't bad people, but I was never really part of their world. I grew up knowing something didn't fit, that there was a gap in my story no one wanted to fill." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. How did you find out about me?" James let out a short, humorless laugh. "I always knew. They never told me the truth, but you learn to read the silences, the avoided looks, the conversations that abruptly end when you walk into a room. When I turned 16, I started asking questions. I searched through records, old documents, hospital files. It was difficult." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the pain wash over her. "I'm sorry." James stared at her intently. "Are you?" Sarah lifted her gaze. "Yes." James studied her for a few seconds, as if deciding whether he could believe her or not. Then, "And tell me the truth, all of it." Sarah felt Oliver's hand rest on hers. He wasn't defending her, nor was he interfering. He was simply offering silent support, a reminder that she wasn't alone, even though at that moment she felt like she was. She took a deep breath and spoke. She told him about her youth, about being locked away, about how her father had made every decision for her. She told him how she had cried every night after they took him from her, how she had tried to bury it all just to keep moving forward. James listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. When Sarah finished, silence once again filled the room. Finally James spoke. "So you just left me?" Sarah felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. "It wasn't like that." "Yes, it was," he replied coldly. "Maybe your father made the decision, but you accepted it. You didn't look for me. You didn't try to get me back. You just forgot about me." Sarah shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I never forgot you." James looked at her, a mixture of pain and skepticism in his eyes. "And how do you expect me to believe that?" Sarah had no answer. Oliver, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "You can't change the past, but you're here now. You have the chance to do something with this." James looked away. "And what am I supposed to do with this? Pretend everything is fine? That this is my home now?" Sarah gripped the table tightly. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want you to give me a chance to know you." James remained silent. His face showed an internal battle, a conflict between resentment and longing. Finally he sighed. "I don't know what I want." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her throat. "You don't have to know right now. I just want you to know this door will always be open for you." James didn't respond right away. He stood from his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I'm leaving." Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. "Please, tell me you'll come back." James hesitated. He looked at Oliver, then at her, and finally at the door. "I don't know." Sarah felt her world shatter all over again as James stepped through the door. Oliver walked over and wrapped his arms around her. "You gave him the truth. Now it's up to him what he does with it. But Sarah couldn't help wondering if she had lost him forever. The following days were torture. Sarah woke up each morning hoping James would return, but the house remained empty. Isaac and Margaret sensed the tension, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. "Mama, why are you so sad?" Margaret asked one night. Sarah held her tightly. "Because I miss someone. Will they come back? I don't know, sweetheart, I don't know." Oliver watched her, knowing there were no words that could ease the weight of uncertainty. A week later, while Sarah was in the kitchen, she heard footsteps at the entrance. When she turned around, she saw James standing in the doorway. Her heart stopped. "I wasn't sure if I should come back," he said. His gaze lowered. Sarah stepped forward cautiously, as if afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. "But you're here," she whispered. James nodded slowly. "I have questions. A lot of them." Sarah felt relief wash over her. "I'll answer them all." He looked at her, his eyes filled with emotions he wasn't sure how to express. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive you." Sarah swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." James sighed. "But I want to try." Sarah felt tears stream down her face. Not everything was fixed. Not everything was healed. But at least the bridge wasn't completely broken. And maybe with time, the love that had been stolen at birth could find its way back. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapters. And tell me where you're watching from. We love knowing how far our channel reaches.